decades, we've been told there's still time to act, to confront the problems arising from an increasingly disrupted climate. If we can only change this one thing, which could then lead to changing another thing. An incremental approach to what is now a raging fire. Well, it's a bit late to take a cup of water to a building engulfed in an inferno. The alarms have been ringing for quite some time. But who's responded? Who will be responding? We're going to find out on the road to Glasgow.
I'm Shonagh Smith, and the United Nations Climate Change Conference is coming to my country, Scotland, at the end of 2021.
The climate has been on just about every country's agenda. The United Nations created a climate treaty where the nations of the world became parties to that treaty. And every year, the nations come together with the aim of bringing about real change for the global climate. This annual meeting is a conference of the parties of the treaty known as COP, and this year will be the 26th coming together, and a critical one, as the world is at a unique crossroads, coming out of a pandemic, able to reset and restart community, culture and country. And this year, it's coming to Glasgow, Scotland.
There are two ways to look at the climate change problem, that the Earth is there to serve you, or that humans have to fit in with the world. Since way back to Roman times, unfortunately, it's primarily been the former than the latter. For most of those centuries, mankind really didn't know better. But starting in 1972, and specifically 20 years later in 1992, humans did know better. I reached out to renowned conservationist and climate change expert Harvey Locke in the beautiful Canadian Rockies to explain.
In the late 1960s, the world became aware that we were starting to run into trouble with the environment, the natural world around us. And that led to a surge in public consciousness. And the first global conference on the environment was held in Stockholm in 1972. The United States passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. And there was a lot of energy around concern for the environment at that time. Then it kind of relaxed a little bit, and then in the late 1980s we were seeing the hole in the ozone layer, an awareness that the climate was starting to change, huge deforestation of tropical rainforests, and that again led to this crescendo of interest and this big global meeting in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 that was called the Rio Earth Summit. And the presidents and prime ministers of all the countries in the world gathered and negotiated 3 global conventions or treaties. One on the climate, one for biodiversity or nature, and another on combating desertification. When we hear about the road to Glasgow or the Glasgow Climate COP, it's an outgrowth of those 1992 Rio conventions.
We've had 25 COPs, 25 meetings so far of the countries of the world, starting in Berlin in 1995, moving around the globe every year with different host countries or presidents, each with the goal to address climate change at a global level. Out of those, only a few produced solid, tangible action. Kyoto in 1997 and the Paris Agreement in 2015. What went right? What went wrong?
When the Climate Convention, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was negotiated, they wrote the big ideas, but they didn't get down to details. The first effort to get down to details was called the Kyoto Protocol, and that is a reference to the place in Japan where the thing was negotiated in the 1990s. Later, there was a Paris Agreement negotiated in Paris to replace what many people perceive as the failed Kyoto Agreement. So if we look at the first one, the Kyoto Agreement, there were good things about it, but there were problems with perceptions of fairness. For example, the United States, which was the largest emitter in the world at the time of greenhouse gases, was in, and then it was out, and then it was out because it also said, well, these developing countries like China and India are doing these big emissions and they don't have to do anything, and we don't think that's fair. Eventually it just lost momentum and kind of foundered. There was an effort in a place called Copenhagen to come up with a new agreement, and it failed miserably. And it wasn't really until 2015 when actually China and the United States got together ahead of the meeting, and the French put an enormous amount of effort into making the Paris meeting work. And then everybody got together and came to an agreement that sought to limit warming to less than 2 degrees more, and ideally more 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that sort of became the target, and then the method for getting there became known as going to carbon neutrality or net zero carbon, the idea being by 2050 our economy has to run without having carbon dioxide emissions going into the atmosphere from anywhere more than are being absorbed by nature. So in other words, achieving an equilibrium.
So Harvey, the Paris Agreement had two goals. One was to limit global warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels, and the other was to achieve carbon neutral by mid-century.
One of the great challenges of our time is protecting nature, because it's much easier to just keep exploiting it. The idea of setting targets for how much of nature we should protect started in a serious way in the 1990s with a goal of 10 or 12% of the world. Then in 2010 we realized that wasn't enough. It was increased to 17% on land and 10% in the ocean. That's very clearly not enough. And now there's a very serious conversation about protecting at least 30% of the world, land, ocean, and freshwater systems by 2030, which is a really big advance. The challenge, of course, is the science says we should be protecting about half the world in an interconnected way. So we've certainly got to meet at least 30% by 2030, but we have to go right past that to the higher number if we're really going to get this under control.
The Paris Agreement in 2015 works on a 5-year cycle of increasingly ambitious climate action, which brings us to COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, in November of 2021. This is the crossroads where climate action needs to step up.
So we've come to an interesting moment in time. The science is absolutely overwhelmingly clear that our relationship with nature is completely out of balance. We're changing the climate, we're overfishing the oceans, we're destroying natural ecosystems far faster than they're being repaired. We knew this in 1972, that this could happen to us, but we had time to react. Then in 1992, when the Rio Conventions were signed, we said, now it's really time to act, because we're out of time. Because if we don't act, things are going to get worse. Well, things have gotten worse and we haven't acted enough. So this year, the whole world needs to come together and say, we are going to change course, we're going to make a transformational change, and we're going to create an equitable, nature-positive, carbon-neutral future so that we can look our grandkids in the eye and say, we finally acted when we had to. It may have been the last minute, but we turned this thing around for the better of all.
How have countries done under these protocols and agreements? Are we seeing results? Are we moving backwards? When we come back, let's see who gets the gold stars. It might surprise you.
In 1972, the climate specialists, the weather forecasters as you might say, predicted a storm coming if things didn't change. 20 years later, at the Rio Earth Summit, the predictions were made more dire. Under current emissions and consuming of nature, the storm was getting close. We had the privilege of crying out, there's still time to act. I don't think we have that privilege anymore. The storm is now upon us. In 1972, the world population was 3.8 billion. Now, in 2021, it's doubled. What was hard to accomplish as far as climate goals with 3.8 billion becomes monumental with just under 8 billion. That is why we're now in the storm. It's why we cannot say there's still time. In getting ready for Glasgow, there are a series of meetings around the globe to discuss the climate emergency, beginning with Harvey Lock's global goals for nature and climate. In addition, 3 big meetings are scheduled as we walk down the road to Glasgow, with the UN pre-COP meeting in Milan, Italy, the Biodiversity COP in Kunming, China, and Climate Week in New York City. In March of 2021, Harvey Lock held a virtual conference on global goals for nature and climate. I asked Harvey what was his goal, his purpose at this conference.
We gathered people from all over the world on a virtual conference to discuss an exciting new idea about creating an equitable, nature-positive, carbon-neutral world. And the core idea there is to say the goals of human development, goals of fairness and equity, reducing poverty, that kind of thing, are dependent on nature. And similarly, goals for the climate are dependent on nature. And how we behave in our development goals and in our climate change mitigation efforts also affects nature. So they're all profoundly interconnected. And we wanted to explore how, taking a variety of viewpoints from all over the world, we can imagine a future where all of this comes together in a synergistic way that takes us from a period of despair towards the future of the Earth, towards a positive vision we can all get behind of this idea of an equitable, nature-positive, carbon-neutral future that can give us all hope.
Heading into Glasgow and COP26, how would you grade the countries? Have we seen improvement since Rio?
The scorecard, generally speaking, since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 is one of large-scale failure. The big problems of a changing climate, of an extinction crisis, of increased desertification and degradation of natural systems were clearly known in 1992, and they've all gotten substantially worse since. Having said that, there are some bright lights. For example, the Kingdom of Bhutan, a small country, a developing country in the Himalayas, has protected over half its country in an interconnected way. Costa Rica is another example of a country that's in a lot better shape now than it was in 1992.
One of the acknowledged global leaders is Costa Rica, a small Latin American country with huge biological diversity. And Costa Rica added the right to a healthy environment to its constitution in the early 1990s. And since that time has just achieved remarkable progress on a number of fronts. They have reversed the process of deforestation. So in 1990, they were down to about 25% forest cover. They're now over 50% forest cover. They have protected almost 30% of the lands and waters of Costa Rica. They are protecting species at risk, and the right to a healthy environment is being used by communities and environmental organizations to hold the government accountable for protecting the environment. They also generate over 98% of their electricity from renewable sources of energy like solar, wind, and geothermal. They also have a carbon tax that is the revenue from which is used to pay indigenous peoples and farmers to protect and conserve forests. So Costa Rica is a great example.
We know by experience that having protected areas and having nature as part of our development model is good for the economy, it's good for our welfare, it's good for well-being at the end. And it is around this element of having nature in the heart of our development model that we have been making a lot of progress in the last 30 years. We knew that there was a lot of deforestation, and at that time, we started to make some changes at the policy level, at the regulatory level, and also with the incentives.
I'm going to catch up with the President and CEO of the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York City, Dr. Christian Samper, to further talk about the importance of nature on climate.
We think conservation is a very important part of meeting the overall goals, because nature-based solutions can account for about 1/3 of the solution to the climate crisis. So we actually think that conserving forests and restoring ecosystems and coastal systems is a key part of the solution, which has been underplayed and underestimated so far. But when we talk about conservation, it also means about what happens around these areas. It means restoration, it means rewilding. Okay. It looks about how we develop a more holistic view of conserving the planet.
How would you score the major players on biodiversity?
Well, we need all the nations of the world to really come together around this. And when you think about biological diversity, of course, the biodiversity tends to be in many developing countries still. I think many of them have taken very important steps and measures and really increased things like protected areas. I think that's been something really important. But to really be able to halt the destruction of these ecosystems and these places and to restore them, we also have to look at this globally and look at the supply chains and trade and the impacts of climate on this as well. I think Europe has actually made some very important steps in the last few months, really relating to climate and nature-based solutions and the conservation of biodiversity. I think that's important. China has taken some really important steps domestically. They're right now in the process of creating a national park system. They've taken very good measures relating to wildlife trade. I think that's something valuable. But I think it's going to require all of us working together to really be able to do this, because it all needs to add up to something that's equivalent to the whole planet.
Right, makes sense.
The challenge we have is many countries have declared protected areas but are not managing them effectively at this point. So what we need to do when we talk about the 30 by 30 is both increase the amount of areas that are protected to 30%, but that 30% has to be in the right places and the right areas.
Is the key to protecting these environments involving the local indigenous communities?
There's no doubt that they're major players. These are communities that have lived in these areas for thousands of years or many generations. They understand it, they shepherd, they steward this land, and they're key. There's no way we're going to reach 30 by 30 without working with local indigenous communities, who after all, in most cases, are really great stewards of their lands.
Talk is fine, but the planet's climate won't improve with just meetings and conferences. We can no longer afford to kick the can down the road to Glasgow. When we come back, we'll find out what needs to happen at COP26 for the sake of the planet. Dr. Sam Pear mentioned China and the US and how they're doing on the conservation effort. But overall, have China and the US improved over the years? If we go back to the Rio Earth Summit, China had a very large, impoverished population, and as such, they weren't a large carbon emitter. But as their society has grown, the impoverished have become the middle class. And now China is the #1 carbon emitter in the world.
So when we look at China, there's some interesting things coming out of there, and a big concern was they hadn't committed to going to carbon neutrality until recently, where they've committed by 2060 they will be a carbon neutral country. So all of this stuff has to come together, and the Chinese do see the need to do this holistically, and they're interested in having a conversation with the rest of the world about this eco-civilization idea. I'm not saying that China has been perfect, but I am saying there's a lot going on there that's really worth the rest of the world paying attention to. And of course, the next question is, well, what about what they do outside of China? And this is one of the great questions for all countries. We have to walk the talk at home and abroad, all of us. And so those conversations are also very active with China.
And the US? How would the United States be graded on its nature and climate scorecard, especially over the last 30 years?
If you look at the United States as an example, you see a really interesting mixed picture. It wasn't very long before that the Cuyahoga River in Ohio was actually on fire. There were a lot of species going extinct, and there was a lot of really deep concern that national symbols like the bald eagle might disappear. And that's gotten a lot better. The river quality is a lot better in the United States now than it used to be. But if you lived in West Virginia, you'd see an awful lot of mountains that have disappeared, a lot of rivers that have been polluted. What we have to do now is do more than try. We have to focus on succeeding all the time, and we have to move beyond mixed bags into a constant stream of success if we want to get ourselves out of the hole we've dug for ourselves by only succeeding sometimes.
And this is why small incremental steps will no longer work as a strategy. We have to take big steps now, and not just in one arena. We must look at climate and nature and develop a strategy for immediate implementation. This is what the climate experts are hoping Glasgow becomes, a milestone on the road where the storm was pushed back. COP26 comes to the UK. When the nations meet in Glasgow in November of 2021, the experts will be looking at the 5 years since the Paris Agreement and going forward setting more ambitious goals. But will it be enough? all the commitments from Paris would not keep the temperature change below 1.5 Celsius and carbon neutrality by 2050.
I think the Paris Agreement was a very important step forward to have these commitments, but it's clear that all the voluntary commitments we're seeing don't add up to enough to the solution. Even the new commitments that are coming in are still falling short, so we need to scale up our ambition.
People are frustrated. 25 COPs, and the storm is happening. What needs to happen at this conference of the parties? What would give Glasgow COP26 high marks, the gold star?
A gold star performance at COP26 would be a very focused commitment of all the countries and all the other actors that are engaged in the climate space to say, we are going to meet the 2030 goals of carbon dioxide reduction, combined with a decision that all actions taken to either mitigate climate change, which means to prevent it in the first place, or to adapt to it, all actions will be nature positive. If we had that, we would have made a giant step forward towards the future that we need.
I hope the governments of the world really come together and scale up ambition. It's clear that despite the best intentions, we're not doing enough to really tackle and solve the climate problem. So we need to scale up the ambition, so that all these pledges add up to more. We need to make sure that we support least developed countries and some of the small island developing states in this. But one of the things I really hope is that the nature-based solutions to climate get a much more prominent role in this, and that they get more of the finance, because we are convinced that this is one of the win-win solutions. By protecting natural ecosystems, we help solve climate, we protect biodiversity, and we protect local livelihoods. So it's a win-win-win. We need more of that.
There's a road through this storm, and in this year there are key moments, a key coming together of scientists, activists and politicians who can carry the momentum forward all the way to Glasgow. There's simply no time left. A couple of key meetings are scheduled before we get to Glasgow. All eyes will be on Kunming, China, where the Biodiversity COP15 will be held in early fall. But before that, the leaders will be meeting for the UN's pre-COP in Milan, Italy, to set the stage for how COP26 will turn out. Join us as we look into these meetings on the next Road to Glasgow.